that peer support comes in just about 1 million shapes and sizes. I would rather we didn't get into the thing that peer support equals a peer support worker. And whether that's in the statutory or the non-statutory or peer-run services. I think the second thing is, I do think peer support workers are useful, but I do think there are other ways of accessing the expertise of lived experience. But I'm going to go and say that actually I do find continuing in all sectors those kind of them and us barriers, the way in which we insist on dividing the mad from the sane, really, really destructive. And I was getting a bit of that when we were talking, for example, about shifts. And I was thinking, you were saying, oh, but peers have special things. Well, hang on, what about me? And I guess there's just something about our continuing tendency to actually recreate those barriers. And I suppose the first set of thoughts I have actually come from my own lived experience. And that is, I think peer support workers are great, but they're not the only people with lived experience in services. The person who saved my life was actually my psychiatrist, and not my first psychiatrist, not because she was a psychiatrist, but because when I decided that my life was over, I was going to lose everything that was important to me in my life, she told me about her own experience of depression and being in hospital and coming back to work. And knowing that she could do that actually was the first time I believed I could. Now, I'm not saying that we go around just employing psychiatrists, but there's something about other bits, other nuggets of expertise, lived experience in services. But are any of you senior mental health professionals who've written about your mental health problems? Do you find you get endless people phoning you up and saying, Rachel, what should I do? Rachel, I've just got a job here, shall I tell them? There are actually loads and loads and loads of people working in all sorts of roles in mental health services who have themselves had mental health problems. And what I think is still tragic is that most of them don't feel they can tell anyone. That it's still some kind of shameful secret. And even where, well, should I? I mean, is it going to be okay? And I really wonder what that says about our really valuing the expertise of lived experience. If we have loads and loads of professionals who really feel they've got this shameful secret, what does it actually mean about the way we value the people we serve? And if I think about it, I'm saying this because I think a lot of these actually apply, and we must think about in relation to peer support. I think the most often thing people say, I just don't feel safe telling anyone. Don't feel safe because I don't think my colleagues will understand. I don't think they'll speak to me. That's one of the major concerns. Not I'm going to lose my job, but what will my colleagues think? And when do I tell them? Do I tell them when I join the team? Oh, by the way, I'm mad. Or do I leave it a bit until they've got to know me? In which case it's really difficult to tell them because then they feel you didn't trust them. I think there's also, and I don't think there's many people who actually lose their jobs now in the NHS, I hope, because they've got mental health problems, but there's a hell of a lot who don't get promoted. And I think we've got to remember that actually we're talking about career progression as well as, I was given advice by my psychiatrist and my boss. They said, don't tell him you've been in hospital, say you've had a bit of stress. Well, I actually thought for about 10 minutes about that and thought, I'm ambitious. If I tell them I've got stress, I'll never get promoted. So I'll risk it with bipolar. But I guess there's just something about those kind of well-meanings. I think there's also, we are plagued by rules about boundaries, aren't we? Professional boundaries. You don't say anything about yourself. And you work in the forensic service, don't you? I went to one in London where they told me you weren't even supposed to tell people you've got about your pets because they might hold it against you. I didn't want my pets, Basil and Henry, God knows. But I guess there's also people, and then loads of people have said to me, but if I tell anyone, won't I get punished? If it all comes back and bites me, what am I going to do? And then I think there's loads of people who haven't got the faintest idea how to use that experience, how to think about using that experience. I suppose my view is that we really can't genuinely promote recovery in our services unless we can reach across that them and us divide and erode some of those boundaries. And you know, some of those boundaries are really, really very material. You know, I wonder who can actually put their hand up and say there is nowhere in your organisation a separate staff toilet. I wonder how many of you can say that in every part of your service, people using that service and staff use the same cutlery, the same plates. So I wrote an article about toilets once, and it said, until we're using the same toilets, don't talk to me about respect. But I think we've got to get rid of some of those very material things. And then, of course, there's all the barriers we set around relationships. And it seems to me that the core essence of our services has to be that we develop relationships that recognise our common humanity. And I don't honestly know how you can do that without sharing something of yourself. I suppose, you know, if we expect people to behave like human beings, how about treating them like human beings? If we expect people to share their feelings, secrets, their most private part, how can we expect them to do that unless we're sharing something of that, something of ourselves? And I do really think that this is actually a two-way street. If you look at some work that Diana Rose and her colleagues did, it was quite clear that people using services really valued it when any staff actually shared something of themselves with people. So I think this isn't the province of a peer support worker. This is actually all of us sharing aspects of our lives. And I suppose I actually think I don't really want to create another them and us, because I go to lots of, what is it they call, what is called living in both worlds, and then there's all sorts of other ones. What's the other one? Sorry? Hidden talents and all those kind of ones. Great. But I'm seeing another barrier developing between staff who've got mental health problems and staff who haven't. So we've got, you know, there's a hierarchy. If you've got mental health problems, you're sort of better at it. I think actually it's the challenge we face is for all of us to share our lived experience, use our lived experience as part of our work, use our experience of life, but also use our experience of trauma, of when things have gone bad, because all of us have got that, yet rarely do we use it in our work. And I think we spend a lot of time thinking about our professional skills, but not enough thinking about our lived experience. So of course that raises the question, well, and actually at a previous ImROC conference, I got challenged and I was asked, well, why do we need peer support workers? We've got professionals with mental health problems. Surely they provide peer support. I'm going to ask you this question at the end, but I would actually say no. I think it is really important that professionals use their lived experience to enhance their professional skills, but I don't think they can be peer support workers. I think by having professionals who have lived experience, you do start to break down some of those them and us barriers. You haven't got posts for the loonies and posts for the same. Which is what we risk if all we have is peer support workers. Then we can put the mad people in the mad people's jobs, leaving all the proper, responsible jobs to everybody else. I'm sorry, you'll have to forgive me. I don't regard myself as a service user or a survivor or a consumer. I am mad. I don't wish to define myself in terms of the services. So that's where I come from in my language, and I'm reclaiming devalued language. I think actually we risk, unless we can actually make sure that people with lived experience have access to all the posts within our organisations, then I think it's dangerous creating peer posts. But I think also we've got to actually think about, if I'm a psychologist and I'm a mental health service user, you're still employing me as a psychologist. Actually, I still have claims to special knowledge. There is that kind of a hierarchy. That's what stops it being peer. So I think we can use our lived experience. So I think what we need to do is actually both. I think we need to actively recruit people with lived experience to every job in our organisations. And we need to create new roles, but most important, new relationships that aren't those relationships with claims to special knowledge. Does that make some sort of sense? I'm going to use a phrase that, how many of you remember Edna Conlon? Oh dear, the history of the service user movement, you have to start learning. Edna was a wonderful woman from Milton Keynes, absolutely superb. And she actually talked about often being accused of shaking hands with the devil. That by working in mainstream services, she was actually getting bound up in those hierarchies, those legal frameworks, that actually prevented any kind of real peer relationships. That that a lot of people have said, actually, real peer support needs to be independent, needs to be outside of that traditional hierarchical framework. I would actually, though, say, for heaven's sake, most people using mental health services, most people with mental health challenges are in our mainstream services. Surely those people deserve access to peer support, and access to peer support when they're at their most vulnerable, when you're at the bottom of that pit. I've got great, I'm sorry, the two people who spoke first about working in an intensive care unit. I take my hat off to you. I think that is the point at which people need peer support. I need peer support when I'm admitted to that acute ward. Yes, it's all very fine afterwards, but I think we've got to remember that that's a critical part too. And I suppose I would argue that it's not either or both. It's not either, but both. Have any of you come across the work that Steve Onkin and Priscilla Ridgway did? There was a big study they did looking at what helped people in their recovery, and a chunk of that was around peer support. And when they talked about what they found helpful, they said they wanted wide availability of peer resources, they wanted diverse models, so they wanted support groups, but they also wanted care managers with lived experience. They wanted actually to see both consumers, they were American, you see, so they're consumers. You know, if you go across the Atlantic or the Pacific, you have to change your language. You can't talk about using spines, you have to talk about consumers. They wanted both people employed within mainstream services and consumer-run peer services and access to a range of different kinds of self-help things. So what they were very much saying is we need the lot. It's not either or, it's both. And what they also said was that they found it infighting between different factions of peer support singularly unhelpful. I want though to think about outside of services, because actually many people have found peer support outside of formal services really helpful in settings where you can really develop reciprocal relationships. Where you can get ongoing support under the vagaries of whether you're being discharged or not. I'm sure most of your trusts are rapidly discharging people to GP care. Actually, that means to nothing. So actually, we need to be thinking about that. And obviously there's loads of things. We've got obviously peer support groups run in the voluntary sector organisations. We've got peer-run organisations, not so many here as in other countries. Peer-run groups, services. We've got e-groups. Now, I'm too paranoid, and Julie, I'm not old, only a bit, but I don't want anything to do with all these Facebook and crises. But actually, I do know a lot of people for whom those kind of e-groups are really a lifesaver. That at 2 o'clock in the morning, that's the only people you can actually turn to. That's where you get your support. Buddying programs, mentoring programs, self-help communities, networks. You were doing some stuff, weren't you, Steve, with Prosper? I got a bit lost in social movement theory, but I'm sure it was very good. Sorry? Well, it was a bit complex. Though, I'd have to ask about a lot of services outside of the statutory sector. Are they really independent? You find me one that doesn't in some way take money from the state. You find me one that doesn't have some kind of an agreement about who they can serve and who they can't serve and what they have to do. And I see a really sad thing. I see really exciting programs all of a sudden getting bogged down in rules and procedures. Anything that goes wrong, any question, and you invent a policy. I can assure you that is the way to the NHS. When I left South West London, the policies, I collected them all, stood this high off the ground. You had 141 information governance processes, and so do you. You had all your HR policies, your safety There are millions of them, but they build up gradually. And it's very easy when something happens, you say, let's have a rule. Let's have a rule. Let's say whether this person can come or can't come. And have you any of you read Mary Hagan's book, Magnus Made Me? Did I make you read it? It's good, isn't it? But what she actually talks about is that there's a very real risk that peer-run services start to look really rather like their statutory alternatives. That you do tend to get these boundaries between the helpers and the helped. And the helpers are the ones who make the rules. I was talking to a small music group, entirely peer-run music group, and they were telling me how they'd gone to, what's that festival? You know, Glastonbury, that's it, Glastonbury. I'm too old. They've been to Glastonbury. I said, oh, did you all go? They said, well, no, we had to decide who was suitable and who wasn't. And I thought, who is the we? And well, some people wouldn't have been able to manage it. And you end up in those kinds of discussions, those kinds of hierarchies. Peer workers, group leaders often set the rules for engagement, who we can't cope with, what acceptable behaviour is. I met a guy who'd been actually excluded both from Samaritans and Mad Pride. His behaviour was unacceptable to other people and disruptive. And I think, really, we've got to go back again. Who's read Judy Chamberlain On Our Own? You must read it. Judy Chamberlain is the origin of ideas about recovery. In 1977, she actually wrote a book that was called On Our Own, which was saying, we need to be actually running our services ourselves, on our own. We don't need well-meaning professionals. Sorry, I'm a well-meaning professional too. But what she said was, it isn't going to be easy. I'm going to quote for her. We must begin to turn toward those people we now isolate, the troubled and troubling relatives and friends we both love and fear. It will not be easy. The mental health system developed precisely because this is a job we'd rather leave to others. And I do see an awful lot of people, because they're very distressed, because they find it difficult to behave in the ways that others expect, being denied access to some of those peer opportunities. And I do think that's something we have to take very seriously. And I always get to what is peer anyway. You know, one of the problems with traditional services is they lump people together because they've got mental health problems. One of the challenges of peer support is that we lump people together and assume they're peers because they've got mental health problems. My peer group was actually quite an interesting one. I'm not allowed to tell you who was in it because we agreed we would never do it. But my little group was 4 people working in extremely senior positions in health and social care, and we met about once every 3 months in the Royal Festival Hall. And we were friends, we had all sorts of relationships outside, but this was when we met, and we called it Talking About the Untalkable, which was when we could actually look at what it meant to all of us to be in those positions. I think one of the challenges we face is actually to move beyond thinking about service land. I think people need lives, not peer support. People don't need services, they don't need psychologists, they don't need intensive care, they don't need a certain outreach. People need lives. And I think lives is quite simple, isn't it? Somewhere decent to live, someone to love, and something to contribute to your community. And I guess when we think about intentional peer support, whether it be in statutory services, whether it be outside, is what's its actual role in helping people to get lives? Is it to provide social contact for lonely people? That would be called, I learned some language, bonding social capital. Or I read sometimes, you see. Sometimes I'm on the internet. Or is it to actually provide a bridge to help people to find those friends, networks, peers, non-peers, for their own lives? That would be called bridging social capital. That's right, isn't it, Julia? I think you've got that right. I don't think services of any sort can offer the ordinary reciprocal friendships and relationships that people need. There will be hierarchies, and we will let people down. You know, even peer support workers go on holiday, move jobs, get fed up, go and become taxi drivers or researchers, isn't it, Emma? Where are you? You let the side down, haven't you? You're a trainer and a researcher. My friend Sue, I mean, she's going to be a recovery college person. And we'll always set boundaries. We had that discussion about Facebook. Because they aren't those ordinary relationships. We know that social isolation is seriously bad for you. For those of you who are into all this healthy living stuff, it's worse for you, being isolated is worse for you than obesity, lack of exercise and alcohol. It's as bad for you as smoking is. And you know, we had all these ideas. Who remembers normalisation? Do you remember normalisation? Well, in those days, friendships with service users was bad, and friendships with normal people in the community was good. I'm getting a little bit worried that we're almost, with our recognition of the importance of peer support, kind of turning that on its head and saying relationships with peers equals good, relationships with people outside isn't. I don't think we've got there yet, but I think there is a danger. And I suppose, if you think about it, go back, who's read Goffman? Oh, you must have read Institutionalisation. One of the real challenges of institutions was that the identity of mental patient, service user, survivor, consumer, actually took over and replaced all other identities that a person had. We've done the same in a post-institutional era. For many of the people who use mental health services of any sort, the ones in Mind, the ones in Rethink, the ones in whatever your local ones are, actually their primary identity, the way in which people define themselves, the way they cluster together, is actually around that identity of mental patient. And I think the reality is that we need partners and friends and acquaintances who actually reflect all the facets of our being. And I think that means people who shared significant experiences with us. That may be the experience of mental health problems. It may be the experience of school. How many of you meet up with school friends and college friends? That's one part of a network. We also need people who we identify with, people with whom we share faith, a culture, identity, roots. You know, actually, I want you to find me the decent, radical, feminist, lesbian community. I don't mean any old gay community. I want a radical, lesbian, feminist community. That's where my roots are. That's where I sit. I think we do need to find those people who share that identity of ours. And I think we also need people who share our interests. I'm a member of the MX5 Users Club. That's an e-group, by the way. And MX5 is a carb. Wow. I don't think I'd want to be best friends with those people. But actually, they're part of my networks. They're part of me. That's part of reflecting. And I think, possibly the most important role for peer support, wherever it is to actually be that bridge, to help people to find those ordinary reciprocal relationships with peers, with whoever reflects those parts of their identity. I think that is what we should be doing, and I think that's how we should be judging what we are doing. Do we help people to get lives that they find meaningful, satisfying, valuable, lives that they live not in isolation but with other people of their choosing? I'm going to shut up there. Was that anything to do with peer?
Can I just ask you one? I'm going to get
She's going to ask me a question.
I'm going to ask you one because that's a lot about HCAs, peers, stuff. Yeah, so you've looked at professionals with lived experience and the fact that they're not peers. What about HCAs with
Do you know, I hated, we once wrote a paper called Should Psychiatrists Wash Socks?
Yeah.
I have spent the entire of my professional career with each different group of workers saying, OTs don't take people to the pictures, psychologists don't do this, defining our boundaries. You know, there's a really depressing thing. If you actually go and look what people want and what different groups of workers say they do, they don't match up at all. Actually, I think our job, the job of a peer, is being alongside someone. And I think that means helping them to get up in the morning. I think that means going shopping with me. I think it means sitting with me. I think it means actually giving me that practical help, that someone to travel alongside me in all facets of what I do. So, well, you see, how many healthcare assistants are there? You see, I'd abolish healthcare assistants. I actually believe that healthcare assistants could morph into something that was actually those people who walk alongside you. Those people who don't have claims to all these psychological theories and telling you they've got negative dysfunctional cognitions and all that kind of stuff.
What do we do with all the brilliant HCAs we've got?
What if you abolish nurses? Nurses are not health.
But I suppose what I'm saying is, why don't, if you're asking me how we change services, I think people, a number of people who've wanted just someone to travel alongside them, someone to work out where to take a cat when they're sick. No, that's not a job of a psychologist, but I've done it on that several times. Actually, people do want someone to be alongside them, and I think that is a role very often that healthcare assistants have in services or support workers.
Okay, look,
So I'm going to want.
confused.
Okay, I think those could well be peer workers, but I would have some other roles. I think I might have someone do welfare rights experts. I think I might have someone who did employment services. I think I might have someone who's a personal trainer. I think actually we've got to look at what people need to live their lives.
So why is it that I'm hearing Natalie say we don't have healthcare assistants or peer support workers, and yet describes people doing exactly the same as what we have, who are healthcare assistants or peer support workers? So I think it's a matter of name.
I mean, I suppose I go back to the stuff from Recovery Innovations. It's not what you do, it's how you do it.
That's good.
That actually you can do something in a peer way or you don't do something in a peer way. And I think if we start limiting tasks, it'll be dysfunctional for our clients. We've got to actually let people direct what they need. And I say, oh, no, I'm sorry, that's not much. Actually, it drives clients mad. If you think about the newspapers research, newspapers monitoring, the thing that drove people most mad was actually being told, oh no, you'll have to ask someone else for that. I think it's actually about how we're alongside people. I can't do that because I've got all this baggage of psychological theories on my shoulders. Neither can a doctor. They've got all this baggage of neurotransmitters.
Nurses don't have any baggage of things.
Well, I think nurses, well, I don't know. I think the skill of nursing is to get people to actually comply with what everyone else is telling them to do. Take a big pill.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I'll tell you what, I'm not going to have a yes-no because it's too complicated.
My yes no was actually about professionals. Yes. I'm sorry, I'm not very good at closed yes no questions. So someone wants to say something.
Yes, okay. Can you stand up a bit so people at the back
Shout.
Yeah, I'm not very good at shouting. I was just going to ask you, because you mentioned a lot about the roots of recovery and in the sort of service user activism. What I'm interested in is that at the moment, when you look at sort of radical service user activism, there's a lot of there's a movement called the anti-recovery movement, which is very concerned about the politicisation of the recovery movement at the moment. I was just wondering what your responses were. There's been a huge amount on like Twitter, you've got the recovery in the bin bowl. Yeah.
No, I've seen all that stuff. I suppose I have two thoughts. One is recovery is not about what services do, whether they're statutory, voluntary or peer run. Recovery is the journey of an individual. I think there is a grave risk of a professional takeover of that. So I can find famous people who've written manuals about how to do it. First of all, you get someone to tell their story. Then actually I think we have. And I suppose any powerful idea risks being taken over. And I think that whole movement is reflecting the move from the roots of actually in user activism in the American civil rights movement, actually. And I do think we've got to be very careful about a professional takeover of recovery. We've not got to be asked, is this a recovery intervention? I can't be, the idea of a recovery intervention just leaves me cold. What we've got to ask about is every single thing we do in something, is this helping this person in their journey? Or is it getting in the way of them? And it doesn't matter what we do, that's the fundamental question. I do, though, think there's another problem. That any liberation movement has difficulties when it's successful. That if we are successful in enabling people to have lives, then in a sense we leave behind those people who've devoted their entire life to user activism. And I think the more successful people become, the more you tend to leave behind some of those roots and make some of those roots feel de-skilled. You can see it in the broader disability movement as well. You can see it in some of the lesbian and gay movement. There's a whole set of people whose lives have been built on trying to attain that liberation and now feel a little bit redundant. And I wish to honour some of that history, and I think it's important that we do honour it. It's another history. We can, the professionals have even taken over recovery to the point that they've changed what the history is. They decided the history was the York Retreat. Now, the York Retreat was humane psychiatry. It was trying to be nice to people, but it was a service-led. It was nothing to do with people's lives.
No, that's fine, Richard.
Right. So I think there's two things. Professional takeover, be careful.
Yeah, and we have, one of the things we're really careful, we can't ignore that, we've got to constantly be But I still maintain that one of the reasons we've set up ImROC, and it's the reason that recovery is now kind of really central to the way that services work, is because we're trying to listen to what people want and trying to get it right, and it's really sad that that's not seen as a professionalisation.
Absolutely. I think you're right, but actually I think one of the things there is to really go back to some of the stuff that Judy Chamberlain talked about. And she talks a lot about, actually we don't need to be saved by radical professionals. We don't actually need to be saved by Thomas Sachs or Lang or the people who did, what's it, Soteria House. That there's always going to be a radical professional there waiting to save you. We've got to actually say this is our lives, and the centering of our lives, it's our journey, where we've been, where we are now, what we've got going forward and where we want to get to. That's the centre. Anything else does it help us in that journey?
Just get James's question.
Isn't there a risk in that of then that being used for a political gain of, well, if people are going to look after themselves, we don't need to provide money for services, and used for sort of the ideology of privatisation?
I didn't say people were going to look after ourselves. I talked about us looking after each other, which is a very different thing. I would ask, I'm not going to go to the wall to defend the NHS as it applies to mental health services. Sorry, I come from a radical socialist background, because it's very easy to ask more of the same of what we've got now, without actually recognising that we've been criticising what we've got for a very long period of time. So I think it's not about actually saying we don't want resource, but wouldn't it be neat? How much does it cost to keep someone in an inpatient ward? Sorry, £1,000 a day? Sorry? It's not 1,000 a week. It's a lot more than that. Sorry? 450 a day. I wonder what would happen if we gave that 450 a day to each of the people in there. How many problems would we have solved? It's not about having less, it's about really thinking radically about what we do with it and not getting caught up in the guilds like mine which are trying desperately to preserve our own existence. Any professional will tell you all you need is more of them. All you need is more nurses, more doctors, more psychologists, more OTs, more social workers, and then everything will be fine. That's not true. And I'm one.
Okay. Rachel, we're going to carry on talking and entertaining us for the next week, actually, because she's very, very interesting. Everything she says, I would come in and say, but. I know, well, I do, but I do think there's a few interesting things there. A few interesting things. I think it is, I did I really like this spring quote from Judy Chamberlain, particularly. I think this reminds us that if we as peer support workers are saying we do not ever get involved in restraining people, that's too pure for us, then that leaves it. That says, well, therefore we can't look after those most disturbed
most disturbing, most disabled people, because we're saying, no, as peers we can't work with them because we might have to restrain them. So there's something around that, I think. But I didn't say that, but you know, what if we're saying we can't restrain people, what happens then? We back off at the last minute and let somebody else restrain the people. We are saying that we would never restrain someone. I think that's right. Don't restrain anybody at absolutely the last point. But then if we, in our previous thing, we're saying that peers don't restrain, then aren't we then saying we leave that for somebody else to do? And Judy Chambers say exactly that. The mental health system developed to do those jobs with those people we find very difficult. I thought that was really, I think that's really helpful, Rachel. And I suppose I would like to ask the question, myself, I do believe that I can be a professional and peer support worker at the same time, so I totally disagree with you on that, Rachel. But so I'd quite like to say yeses and no. So, and I do, you know, I think I'm probably in the minority, but can we just put up our cards? So do you think you can be a professionally qualified person, nurse, OT, whatever, and a peer support worker? Working as a peer support worker. Okay, can we do yes or no for that one? Oh, this is interesting. 12 people say no, and everybody else says yes. Okay, we got a bit more persuasion to about and of course there is a yes and a no position, isn't there? Because actually these are really hard to get in. Okay, there's a lot though, there's an awful lot to think about, and I don't know about you, but my head's buzzing. Steve, you're going next, aren't you? I'm inviting Steve Burgess. You might have heard about Red. His stuff. He's written a huge amount about peer support, got a big role in research in peer support, and has actually managed to stay friends with all different parties working in this area. Well, third sector groups and anti-recovery groups and peer support groups. So we've asked you to talk a little bit about whether peer support workers actually do have a role as paid employees within statutory services. But do kind of raise whatever you like, because I think it's Rachel's kind of swung on quite a lot as well.
Sorry. Thank you. I'm not sure if it's very easy to follow Rachel because she's already said everything, or very difficult to follow Rachel because she's already said everything. Thanks for having me along today. Most people today, most if not everyone, I'm not sure, has spoken from a perspective of giving, receiving, offering peer support within mental health services, I think. I'm going to offer a slightly different perspective as a researcher. So as a research group in South West London, we've been doing research, large and small projects about peer support in some way or another for nearly 10 years now. Jackie at the back is part of the team. Julie's involved in our current project, as are a number of other people in this room. And lots of people on the team bring their lived experience to the way we do our research. But as a researcher, I'm not going to talk to you now as some kind of expert on peer support. You're the experts in the room. What I'm going to try and do is use that research to reflect on this question. So, do peer support workers have a role to play as paid employees in statutory services? Although I'm going to change the question a bit, because of course there are lots of peer support workers in statutory services, so it's kind of meaningless to debate whether they should be there or not, because we can't just make that decision. It's happening anyway. So I'm changing the question a little bit. We'll get there. Peer workers are being introduced as paid employees in statutory services. How do we ensure that this is a meaningful role? And I understand that role is, that word meaningful might be slightly contentious in this context, because it's suggesting that you might kind of do the role and some of the meaning of being a peer is somehow lost in the work that you do. Rachel touched on the fact that there are some voices from the user and survivor movement, for example, who feel very strongly that peer support shouldn't be within the statutory sector at all, that the role is so eroded there potentially by the culture of services that it stops being meaningful. I kind of thought that that was the question Julie was asking me to address, or at least in part, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So what are the arguments there, if not, why not? Well, of course, as we know, peer support, there's always been peer support outside of services, people supporting each other with their experiences of emotional distress. We all do it. So the very fact of taking that very natural, instinctive thing and making it part of the way in which we deliver mental health services is in itself somehow contrived. Peer support, as has been mentioned several times today, has a very strong values base. The mutuality of the role, the equality of the relationship is somehow essential to peer support. And the argument is made that those values are best protected in peer-led peer support initiatives of one sort or another. And that the organisational culture of large statutory sector organisations like NHS Trust, with the piles of accountability and governance and so on that restrict what people can do, risks eroding the values underpinning peer support. So that's some of the counter-argument. And I'd say all of those things are true, and most people would acknowledge that those things are true. But as I said, and as we all know, peer worker roles are being introduced into the statutory sector anyway. People want to work as peer workers in the statutory sector, and that's really important. People want to use difficult experiences and turn them into positives for themselves and for others. And as has also already been mentioned, there are thousands of people, thousands upon thousands of people, whose main or sometimes only source of support is the NHS, and those people have the same right to access peer support as anyone else. So we must talk about peer support in the statutory sector. It's essential, therefore, that we make sure that peer workers in the statutory sector are properly looked after and supported in the role, and that the peer support that people have access to in the NHS reflects the same values as peer support anywhere else. It's not a different peer support. In other words, that there is a meaningful role for peer workers in the statutory sector. I'm going to reflect on a couple of our projects in relation to that question. So the first is a project we completed 3 or 4 years ago now, which we called the Peer Worker Research Project, surprise, surprise. It was a qualitative project. It was focused on people's experiences, and it contrasted 10 different new initiatives where peer workers were being introduced either into the NHS or into the voluntary sector, into peer-led services, or into partnerships. And we've got some thoughts on partnerships after the break. We interviewed nearly 100 peer workers, the people they supported, the staff they worked alongside, about their experiences. I'm also going to talk about our new project. It's called the ImROC project. It's a very different study. So this is a new initiative around peer support for discharge. So that's peer workers providing one-to-one peer support with people initially while they're still on the ward, and then working with them for up to 4 months in the community afterwards. That's a different study. So it finishes with a trial where we're comparing outcomes for people who receive that peer support and people who don't. It's a very different way of doing the research, and quite a challenging way of doing this research. So what might, going back to the first study, our case study work, what might be problems around peer support in the statutory sector? And what we found in that study, what people told us about, it was all an issue around expectations of the role, what people thought the peer worker role was about. We asked people some, as well as the open-ended questions, we asked people very direct questions. And one of them, the first question was, is there a shared understanding of the role of peer workers in the project that you're working with? And we compared the responses from the NHS projects and the voluntary sector projects, and that's that first pair of columns on the left. So this colour is the yeses. So in the NHS we had 30% of people replying, so that's peer workers, service users and the staff that work alongside saying yes, there is a shared expectation of the role. And in the voluntary sector we had over 60% saying yes. When we asked people how important they thought shared expectations was a shared understanding of what the role was about, everybody said yes. So there is an issue there around, in the NHS, is there a shared expectation of what the peer support role is about? And there's some consequences of that, and some of these have been alluded to today, and many of you will have a good understanding of these things. So some managers were mentioned earlier, can give unclear direction to peer workers, even where there's a job description that clearly says what is in the role and not. And we did find, the most extreme case we found was a manager telling the peer worker, don't tell the rest of the team that you've had mental health problems. So clearly some differences in expectations there. There can be resistance from other members of the team where the role appears to overlap with existing roles. So we find that resistance kind of disappearing, going away when people get to know each other and what the role's all about. But where there's an overlap between the role description, the responsibilities that peers have on other staff they work alongside, that resistance can persist there. And again, this has been referred to a number of times today. Peers can be assigned tasks that limit opportunities to use their lived experience in the role. None of the peers we interviewed said that they minded filling in a form for someone or something like that, but if it limited the amount of time that they could use their lived experience in their role, people found that challenging. We also found people talking about what they refer to as an overly protective team. So we talked about the importance of reasonable adjustments earlier, and how flexibility in the role can be a really supportive thing. But we found that being actually having a negative impact on some people's work experience. So being told you're not doing too well, you don't need to come in tomorrow. So a very kind of paternalistic approach. We talk about peers having boundaries. We found staff being unboundaried. So they treated me like their patient, not like a colleague. So this member of staff that I work alongside, actually, they're not my care provider, but they're treating me as if they were, and actually they're a colleague. And people describing challenges of sharing lived experience, suggesting that the challenges of sharing lived experience in the role were not acknowledged or supported by the people that they work alongside. She becomes unwell when things get difficult. So lack of awareness among the rest of the team that actually if you're expected to share your lived experience in the role, there are lots of strengths and positives around that, but that's going to be difficult too, and that wasn't understood by the people that peers worked alongside. So in balance, the stories that people told us were complicated and did point to it, to where they felt the peer aspect of their role did become less meaningful, and if you like, there were some conditions that came together that made the role really difficult. And one of these is very much around the distinctiveness of the role. I guess the common sense, the received wisdom is that if you share tasks with the rest of the team, then that's good for the team, that's good for the role, it bonds it as part of the team. But actually there's loads of research about introducing new roles into teams, which says that that's the opposite. And that people in a new role actually need to do different things to bring power to that role. They need to offer something that's very different to the rest of the team. And that has to be respected. And then when we had peers feeling not feeling safe and supported in using their lived experience, it's as though they stepped back from doing that. They didn't feel able to do that. And they stepped back into if you like, into a generic support worker role. So there are real issues, I think, around the meaningfulness of the role in the statutory sector and the fragility of that, if you like. I'll skip over that. When we came to do our new study, where we were actually ourselves developing a new role, so this peer support for discharge role, we were very much faced by this question. So can the values base be protected in the statutory sector? Can a meaningful peer worker role exist in the statutory sector? And we set about doing that in a number of ways. The first thing we did in the project is really try and get a good understanding of what those underpinning values are. And we worked with a number of expert panels of people with lots of experience of giving and receiving peer support, of developing new peer support roles, of running peer-led services. And we asked those people to bring their ideas together of what were the values and principles underpinning peer support. And a number of people in the room here were involved in that process in some way. And actually, there's nothing there that you won't all be familiar with. But what we wanted to do is make sure that when we take this very natural thing, peer support, and kind of transplant it into the statutory sector environment to make it a way of delivering mental health services, if you like. That feels like a very strange thing to do. We wanted to try and make sure that those values and principles were protected. So we used them to structure the peer worker training programme. That training programme for our 2 pilot sites in South West London and East London is underway at the moment. We use those principles to guide the supervision and support that the peer workers will receive. We use that to shape the support that peer workers are able or can choose to offer in their work, and we use that to inform the preparation of the clinical teams that the peer workers will work alongside. Will it work? Are we able to address that question in our project? Well, we're not sure. One of the things we've done to try and test that is we've come up with what we've called a principles-based fidelity index. We borrowed the idea of a fidelity index from a drug trial, but we've used it very, very differently. So in a drug trial, a fidelity index would make sure that the treatment that people got, the treatment was being tested is exactly as it's administered and exactly as it's supposed to. So it measures dose and things like that, so people get the right dose at the right frequency. We're not using it in that way at all. We're using it to explore those principles of peer support. And we'll do that through interviews with peer workers, the people they support, and the staff that work alongside them. It's kind of an attempt to measure the extent to which the peer worker role, as we develop it here around support for discharge, embodies those values. And we'll be able to compare that between our different sites in different parts of the country and how that changes over time to test whether or how much those principles might explain any benefits we observe that people tell us about. So that was our question. So just reflecting the question back to you, can we ensure that the peer worker role remains meaningful in statutory services?
Thanks very much, Steve. Time for a couple of questions. You've had your hand up most of the way through that, Blue.
I'd just like to say that I think sometimes there's a misconception of the peer support role in that all it is about is sharing the lived experience. When actually I think just the title and role here can hold weight for a service user that the peer support worker doesn't have to actually share any of their lived experience. And when we're talking about other things coming into roles, like making beds and things like that, that can be done in a peer way, as long as the task is being done with the service user present. As in, you're working together to make that bed. You're having meaningful conversations whilst serving dinner. And all of the physical tasks that, say, a HCA might do, can be done in a way. But you don't have to be literally sharing a lived experience while you're making the bed. It's just the mutuality of them knowing
That's
that
in
you've had
response
that
to
lived
your,
experience.
I think it was in response to things saying that the role could be eroded.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, in our principles, we struggle with that in the top one, because up here it went between shared and sharing and shared and sharing. So it's like, you don't. It's not that you have to share, because that will not directed to share, but that there's a connection that's based on the shared lived experience.
Can I just check, does your research only concentrate on